Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our virtual tour of the Rocky Mountain National Park. We really appreciate your attendance at these virtual outings. They've been extremely well attended. Actually, I think we've had more people at these virtual outings than we have had in the past anyway at our physical real world outings. And so we hope that a lot of you will continue to attend the real world outings once we are able to get those going again, maybe sometime early next year, hopefully. So today we're going to talk about the Rocky Mountain National Park and give you a tour and talk a little bit about the features of the park. So without further ado, okay, Rocky Mountain National Park is in Colorado. It's northwest of Denver. It's easy to get there from Denver. It's about an hour-and-a-half drive. You'll go through Boulder, and which is a nice town, but it's very pretty congested roads getting that far. After that, you'll be on a nice scenic drive up to the town of Estes Park, and Estes Park is where most people stay who are going to be visiting the park for more than a day. There's beautiful little cabins and nice little places to stay there in the park. And when you're there at Estes Park, you're right near the national park. It's right there. So it's a nice place to stay. It's very convenient. And it's just a really great place to visit. Rocky Mountain National Park itself is over 256,000 protected acres. 4.5 million people visit the park a year. Makes it the fourth most visited national park. The Continental Divide runs right through the park, and so therefore the west side of the park, the western slope, all the water from that side eventually drains into the Pacific, and on the eastern side it all drains into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's your east-west Continental Divide. The Trail Ridge Road is another main feature of the park. We'll talk more about that later, but it goes right through from east to west through the park and up to a very high elevation. And so you can drive to a lot of the very beautiful, very remote places in the park. There's 3 mountain ecosystems. We'll talk more about those later. Elevation is a huge theme of the park. It's one of the highest national parks in terms of elevation. There are 5 beautiful visitor centers where you can attend ranger programs and see displays educating you about the natural environment of the park. A lot of outdoor activities, of course. There's hiking galore, rock climbing. It's called the Mecca for bouldering. There's horseback riding available. It'll take you into the park. And then there's the town of Estes Park itself, which is a very nice place to stay with all kinds of activities in that town, as well as, of course, shops and restaurants. As far as the history of the park, way before it was a park, people were living there and using the natural environment for sustaining their lives. And we have archaeological records going back 10,000 years ago, when people were living and hunting, in the park area. A tribe of Indians called the Utes arrived in 1000 AD and inhabited the area up to the time of American settlers moving west into that territory. Arapaho tribe arrived around 1700s, and all of these people used the area of the park mostly for hunting. It's pretty forbidding environment for living in. So most lived down in the lower elevations, but they used the area for catching their game. And there were many trails that were developed to get in and out of the area to pursue their game. And those trails, many of them now are used as the hiking trails within the park. And the Trail Ridge Road that I mentioned was actually originally a hunting trail. And also this was used for spiritual purposes. There's areas within the park that were holy places for the Utes. So the native people, their first contacts with Europeans were Spanish people in the 17th century. These were Spanish colonists who were moving north from Mexico, and at one time, most of the southwestern U.S. was a Spanish colony. Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, and most of Colorado. And so there were contacts between native people and the Spanish settlers starting in the 17th century, and around the 19th century, 1800s, Americans began to push into the territory, and they were mostly trappers in the fur trade. And for most of that period, it was fairly low conflict. Everyone kept to their own and did their own business, and in fact exchanged goods and traded, but there was not a lot of violence. That all changed with the gold rush of the 1850s, and so all of a sudden more Americans wanted to come out to the area in order to find gold, and the Indians were just simply in the way. So the Utes were removed in 1861 by an executive order of the Interior Department, and then this order was papered over by subsequent treaties, which were, as most of them were in the West, fairly deceptive, and took advantage of the Indians and moved them into reservations. The Utes were in a big reservation in what is now Utah, and also in southwestern Colorado. And a few years later, the Arapahoes were also forced into a reservation. The history of settlement by Americans begins in the 1800s. Locally, in 1858, a man named Joel Estes started a ranch in what is now Estes Park, and the town now bears his name. In 1874, a man named Abner Sprague built a ranch in what's now Moraine Park in the national park, and he turned it into a dude ranch, and it was a very successful tourist attraction up until 1962, when it was finally removed from the national park. And what you'll see throughout this presentation is the national park has coexisted with many commercial, touristy sorts of activities within the park for quite a while, most of the history of the park. And I find that pretty interesting, this coexistence of these original businesses with the protected national park lands. So between 1902 and 1915, there's a man named Enos Mills, who was a local nature guide. He conducted guided trips up to the peak of the summit of Long's Peak, which was the highest mountain in the national park. And so he loved the area and began to advocate for protecting that land from further settlement. And in 1915, it was designated a national park. And so here you have a picture that's Abner Sprague there with that beautiful handlebar mustache and the dapper bowler hat, and then his lovely wife next to him. And over up the top left, that's Enos Mills. In 1936, an area called Hidden Valley, which is still in the park. You can drive through on Trail Ridge Road. That was turned into a ski resort. Again, that existed until 1992 when it was finally closed. After the war, 1945, 1966, the visitor centers were built. And in the 1970s, the focus became improving environmental management versus recreation, or a focus more on management even, while encouraging recreation, the environment and education became a priority in the park system. Here's a map of the national park. There are 5 main areas. The area you'll probably visit first, and most people visit almost exclusively, is the heart of the park. And that area is where most of your famous attractions are in the park. There's 2 or 3 of the 5 visitor centers are in this area. Some of the famous areas to hike, like Bear Lake and Sprague Lake, are there in the park. We'll be showing you a lot of features of the heart of the park. And Trail Ridge Road runs right through the heart of the park. It starts off just after you get out of Estes Park, and then continues through the visitor center that's at the Welcome Center for the park. And then if you can see my cursor, it continues through the park from east to west, snaking around back and forth with these switchbacks as it climbs from the altitude of Estes Park, which was 7,522 feet above sea level, all the way to the Alpine Visitor Center, which is 11,796 feet above sea level, which is just about the highest point in the park. Then you descend from the visitor center down the western slope of the park and continue south, and you can come to this area we call the West. The West is the best place to see moose. There is a lake down there that's quite pretty. You could do boating, a little town, and so that's a nice place to visit too. So that's a great drive. It's to do everything. It's at least, just even driving it, you'll spend a full day and not really see everything. The backcountry area is down in this lower right-hand quadrant, and that's where there's the more remote hiking and backpacking opportunities. The big roads don't come through here. It's a little more difficult to get out here. You need backcountry passes, but this is where all the higher mountains are in terms of being able to do mountain climbing. Long's Peak is in this section, which is, as I mentioned, the highest peak in the park. And finally, there's this wilderness area, which is directly north of Estes Park, and it's still part of the national park territory. And there's some beautiful hiking back in there as well. You can do horseback riding back in there too. So there's 113 trails, almost 200 miles of trails. This is a mecca for hiking, and they're all different skill levels, which makes it really great for all ages and all levels of ability to come and enjoy the outside, come enjoy the beautiful nature in the national park in Colorado. And so you've got a half a mile hike on flat terrain around Bear Lake, and then you'll have at the other extreme a 2-day summiting expedition up to the top of Long's Peak. When you're in the heart of the park, a lot of the attractions are quite crowded in the busy season. So the parking is limited at some of these areas. So the best bet is to ride on these great shuttle buses that they provide that take you all around the best spots from areas where there's more parking, some of the bigger visitor centers. As I mentioned, there are 3 ecosystems in the park. There's the montane, which is below 9,000 feet. The subalpine, which is 9,000 to 11,000, and the alpine, which is over 11,000. So as you can see, our ecosystems are defined by the altitude of the terrain. So your montane on this map is indicated by a light green. The subalpine is this darker greenish blue color, and the alpine is all the white area. So you can see there's a lot of alpine habitat. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This map is the same as the map you just saw, but it's tilted on its side. It's tilted 90 degrees clockwise. So you're seeing across the map, it's going from east in Estes Park to west at the Alpine Visitor Center. And you can see the symbol here for the north direction. So a good example of the montane ecosystem is the Moraine Discovery Center. As you can see, it's this beautiful lowland meadow nestled in a beautiful valley between these mountains. The reason it's called the Moraine Discovery Center is that this is evidence of a moraine, which is the leftover debris from glacier activity. Glaciers will scrape away the mountains that they're descending upon and moving along, and then they bring that rock and earth material along with them as they move down the side of a mountain. And then as the glaciers recede in warmer weather, they leave behind all that material. So you can see in this pretty meadow these big boulders that were left behind by the glacier. You can also see the typical shape of a valley that's been created by a glacier, this bowl-shaped, beautiful, smooth, conical valley. And that's typical of glaciers. I have been there a couple times, 2 or 3 times. 2 times that I've been there, the longest, have both been in the late spring, just the beginning of summer, in the middle of June. And at that time, the meadows are covered with these beautiful flowers, and the elk have come up from the lower elevations as it warms up at the higher elevations and as the vegetation begins to bloom up at those elevations. And so whenever I'm there in June, we see many elk, as you'll see through the rest of this presentation. So that gives you a feel for what happens at that montane level. And as I mentioned, these beautiful spring wildflowers at that time of year. And then your fir trees at that ecosystem, the montane, are primarily Douglas fir. And so you'll see those kind of surrounding the meadows of the montane. And more elk. As far as subalpine, now you're talking about more rocks, not as much grassy meadow type area, but rocky area, a lot more elevation, a lot more grade, and big trees. Okay, lots of conifers in that section of the park and in that ecosystem. And so there are also many beautiful waterfalls in the park in the subalpine terrain. And this is one, it's called Alberta Falls. It's right in the heart of the park. And you can get there by going to the Glacier Gorge trailhead, and it's about a 1.6 mile easy round trip hike up to the upper area of these falls. And so you can see we have some characters here enjoying the park along with me, my son and my grandsons. Okay, another very well-attended attraction in the park is called Bear Lake. It's also in the subalpine region, as you can see with the with these fir trees and the higher elevation and the rocks all around. Bear Lake is also in the heart of the park. It's a beautiful half a mile loop trail around the lake, and it's easy to get to. You can drive right up there, or take your guided your shuttle bus there, and it'll leave you right next to that Bear Lake. And so it's a nice, easy hike, but it's just beautiful, gorgeous crater lake created by a glacier up in the subalpine region. Its elevation is about 9,475 feet. In the early 1900s, they built a tourist lodge here, and later on in the 20s, it became a youth camp. So again, it's an example of activities that were ongoing throughout the park, even after it was designated a protected national park area. And over in the wilderness area, there's more subalpine terrain. This is a beautiful hike up to another much smaller crater lake called Gem Lake. And it's a little longer hike. It's 3.5 miles. There's a little bit of elevation gain in that hike, but it's a really pretty hike. Good one for fit people of all ages, as you can see in the picture. Beautiful, beautiful scenic overlooks of the mountains in the distance, and this pretty little Gem Lake at the end of the trail. Another thing we see at the subalpine terrain is the bighorn sheep. So there's about 350 of these sheep in the park. I've seen quite a few of them. You'll see the pictures as we go through. If you're lucky, it's the right time of year and they're out. They're very plentiful and they're very accessible. They're all around these craggy boulder areas throughout the park. The best places to find them are in that heart of the park region at a location called Sheep Lake, and also at Horseshoe Park. So the trees at this in this ecosystem of the subalpine, the dominant trees are spruce and fir, and a special pine tree called the lodgepole pine, a lot of which has been burned and subject to forest fires. And the spruce and fir have been attacked by, well, all the conifers have been attacked by a mountain pine beetle invasion. So they eat away at the bark of these trees and kill them. So there's a lot of that you'll see throughout the Rocky Mountains and throughout Colorado, where there's just huge swaths of these beautiful forests that have been devastated and all brown because of the mountain pine beetle. And they posit that the reason for this infestation is global warming. There's been recorded a 3.4 degree Fahrenheit increase in average temperature in the Rocky Mountain National Park area during the last century. Some more sheep. You can see how they just are so nimble out on these little rocks everywhere. And more sheep. And some more sheep. Okay, and then the third ecosystem is alpine. And alpine is above the tree line. It's above 11,000 feet. So no more big, tall spruce and fir trees. There are no trees at all. It's just this low-lying vegetation, grasses and lichen. This type of vegetation in this area is known as tundra. And so this is a really good opportunity to be able to be in tundra without having to do a lot of work. You can drive along the Trail Ridge Trail and you'll be driving right up into the alpine area above the tree line For about 11 miles of this road, you'll be in the alpine tundra area and above the tree line. So I think that's the uh, the most distance you can drive on a road that's above the tree line in the United States. And there you can stop along the way, and then there are these trails or little footpaths out from the road back into the tundra. So you can go into the tundra and experience it and see what's there without harming that very fragile, delicate ecosystem. So it gives you a good opportunity to be somewhere you might not otherwise be able to visit without a very arduous hike, and also without the potential of damaging this very sensitive environment. And as you can see in the picture, we have some visitors from Florida who aren't quite adjusted to the cool temperature at 11,000 feet in June. And this tundra area is just like a different world. You feel like you're on top of the world. And in many cases, there are 360-degree views, and you're just looking out over this incredible Rocky Mountain range and the beautiful tundra ecosystem. It's just truly majestic. The other thing you have up there, besides the tundra vegetation, is some animals that live in that environment. One is on the left, this yellow-bellied marmot, and he's about the size of a house cat, or maybe a large house cat. And he is all over the alpine and subalpine ecosystems. And over on the right, you'll see a smaller animal, a mammal called the pika. And he's about the size of a big fat squirrel. He looks kind of like a chipmunk. He's really cute. He's always running around all over the rocks. Wherever you go in the tundra, you'll see a lot of them when you're there in the park. But they say he could be extinct by 2100 due to global warming threatening his tundra ecosystem. And finally, you reach the visitor center, the Alpine Visitor Center, which is 11,796 feet. And then you can, from there, walk up to the top another couple hundred feet, and you'll reach the top elevation, which is 12,005 feet. And when you do that, it is truly like you're on top of the world. I mean, everywhere you look, there's beautiful snow-capped peaks and looking down into the deep valleys, and you truly feel like you're on top of the world. So it's a really neat way to get up there. Again, you could drive to within like 100 feet, 200 feet climb, and the climb is on steps. So what could you ask for? It's a little bit of work to get a beautiful view. And as you can see, even in June, the snow piled up there at the Alpine Center at almost 12,000 feet. Then from there, you can continue to drive on Trail Ridge Road down the west side of the park, down the west side of the mountains. And sooner or later, you end up in Grand Lake, or not in, but at Grand Lake, in a small town next to it with some nice shops and restaurants. You can go out boating on the lake. And with the drive there, that's the best place to see moose. There's a lot of places you can stop, and you'll see moose walking along the side of the road. Another activity is horseback riding. So this was a horseback trip that we took into the wilderness area. And if you stay in Estes Park, which is just outside the national park, there's no telling what you might see. Probably a lot of elk. You can see them here camped in front of the inn. And on the right side here, this picture is right outside our deck of our cabin. He had 2 or 3 friends along with him that day too, and they just came right up there and started eating away at the leaves next to the cabin. Another phenomenon of the Rocky Mountains are flash floods, and these are caused by sudden thunderstorms in the mountains, which produce a lot of rain along the side of the mountains. And that rain, of course, descends downhill at a very fast rate. It builds and collects more water as it descends, and quickly can get out of hand and can become a very fast moving wall of water, which can do a lot of damage and is very dangerous and can rise very quickly. In 1976, there was the Big Thompson flood, which was the Big Thompson River, which is overflowing its banks, and it killed 143 people in that area because it was a flash flood, and that was 1976. It wasn't 1876. So, even in the modern times, these things can come out of nowhere and really take a lot of people out. This one measured 31,000 cubic feet per second of water in a 20-foot high wall that moved a 550,000-pound boulder that was as big as a house, where the average stream flow of that river is 67 cubic feet per second, as opposed to 31,000 cubic feet per second. So this was an extremely bad flood, but these flash floods have that type of potential to very quickly, exceed their normal flow and become very dangerous. In 1982, there was a flash flood that busted a dam that was called the Lawn Lake Dam, and that was closer to the park. The Big Thompson flood didn't really hit the park, but the Lawn Lake Dam collapsed, and that flood that resulted from that dam failure really took out a lot of Estes Park, and then it left evidence of itself here at Horseshoe Park, where you can still see in this picture the alluvial fan of that flood and all the debris and boulders that it washed down the mountainside. And so at that time, people figured out that maybe dams aren't always the best idea, and so they have to be considered carefully and constructed just right, and maybe in most cases aren't very environmentally sound. So after that, most of the other dams were taken down in the park. And guess who visited us in Horseshoe Park but more elk? The geology of Rocky Mountain National Park and of Colorado is very interesting. It began 300 million years ago when the ancestral Rocky Mountains formed, and this was formed by uplifting of the land through tectonic activity, in some cases volcanic activity. And then over the next 200 million years, this ancestral Rocky Mountain uplifting was eroded by rain and water and glacial ice and worn down. And then there was another uplifting, and then again, more erosion, more wearing down. So this process formed these layers of rock strata. You can see in this cutaway photo here, where you can see all the different layers which represent different periods of geological history. And so 68 million years ago, the front range of the Rockies as we know it uplifted. And those are the mountains we really see as the Rocky Mountain National Park. So they're quite new mountains in geological time as compared to, say, the Appalachian Mountains in the east. And they are, again, were subjected to glaciers. So they began the erosion process over several ice ages since that time. And so during that process, this original strata of the ancestral Rockies was exposed in many parts of the park as well. And so at that time of that uplifting of the Rockies, the surrounding area was a huge internal sea that stretched from Mexico, what's now Mexico, up to the Arctic. And it was more of a tropical environment in nature, and it was roamed by dinosaurs. There's a lot of still dinosaur finds and dinosaur digs in the area of western Colorado. And as you can see, the glaciers have left this characteristic valley shape, the conic valley, and makes for that pretty valley shape throughout the park and throughout the Rockies. So speaking of glaciers, there are 14 glaciers in the park. They're not the valley glaciers, which most of us think of when we think of glaciers with the beautiful blue ice and the crevasses, but they do have a type called rock glaciers, which are basically just, a bunch of rocks fused together with ice. And then the cirque glaciers, which are these crater lakes. They're really glaciers on top that haven't melted yet on top of a mountain or near the peak of a mountain. So the valley glaciers existed here in the park and gave many of the valleys their characteristic shape, but they haven't existed here for 15,000 years. The glaciers generally receded in the early 20th century at the end of the Little Ice Age, and then they advanced a bit during the 1970s and 80s due to the cooler summer temperatures during that time. And then they've been receding again since the 1990s, and this has been due not to natural cycles, but now this receding is primarily due to anthropogenic climate change or man-made climate change. So glaciers, they don't move uphill when they recede. They just melt faster than they move down the mountain. So that's why they eventually go away, but they start from the bottom and move to the top of the glacier. And so that's glaciers. And that concludes our tour of the Rocky Mountain National Park. And I want to thank you all for sharing this with me. And we hope to see you at future outings, both virtual and real world, in the future with the Sierra Club. Thank you.